Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, Facebook has been fooled again, Diebold voting machines can be remotely controlled, and 93,000 Sony accounts have been hacked. We'll load you up on all of the details. Then, after all of that, we'll tell you how to pimp your home network for speed, plus so much more. All that on this week's episode of TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. It's our 27th episode, and it was streamed live on October 13th for release on Friday, October 14th. My name is Chris, and joining me on Skype, like every single week, is Alan. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris. Everybody.
Hey, welcome back, sir. Welcome back to the show. Now, if you don't mind, I have a couple of pieces of business I want to talk about at the top of the show. First of all, I like to let everyone know that TechSNAP is our systems network and an administration podcast. And we release it in pretty much every format you could want, HD, mobile video, audio only, over at jupiterbroadcasting.com, along with extensive show note links. I'm just going to put that disclaimer here at the top, so that way I don't have to make the disclaimer a bunch in the show. I don't have to always go on and tell you that everything we put in the show notes, it's incredible. It's an awesome resource of the show. And if you want to follow up, there's a lot of times additional information that we put in there, things like that. So go over to Jupiter Broadcasting if you want those links, and look for TechSNAP 27, and you'll find that.
Because I think every single one of the stories in here, there's way more information than we could talk about in one episode.
And some of them have some video that goes along with them and things like that. So
yeah,
it's pretty cool to check out.
And just more technical stuff than really makes sense to actually talk about. So yeah, it's the show notes for TechSNAP are quite extensive and sometimes
a little ridiculous.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that's a little ridiculous is getting better and better all the time is our TechSNAP Reddit subpage. Yes. So many awesome stories on the Reddit this week. And I wanted to just point something out about Reddit. If you follow technology news, but you haven't really wrapped your brain around Reddit yet, I want to show you one of the kind of awesome reasons to do this. Now, this is links.techsnap.tv, and you can submit questions or stories. But check this out. So there's a story on here about, let's say, a programmer, which is going to be a story later in the show, admit that the election machines have been rigged, right?
Yep.
And you'll say, well, let's go see what that was submitted to the TechSNAP subreddit. Let's go see what people commented on. Well, unfortunately, on this story, there's no comments for it on our TechSNAP subreddit. But here's where Reddit's pretty cool, is there's other discussions. Reddit's smart enough to know what other sub-communities are talking about, and these sub-communities span the globe from, like, hardcore Republicans, hardcore left-wings, hardcore Icelanders, conspiracy theorists, I mean, you name it. So you can go in here and see what these other groups are saying and get additional information and context. So if you follow the news, it's an awesome tool for that, and we're using that in this show to make every story we cover better. Reddit maybe is the tool today. I don't know what tool it'll be in the future, but go to links.techsnap.tv, sign up for Reddit, and start submitting stories or voting or leaving comments on our stories in there because it is an awesome resource for the show, but it's also an awesome way for you to stay informed yourself. And if you follow the show and you enjoy it, you'll probably like a lot of the stories that people are submitting to that subreddit because they're people who probably think a lot of the same stuff is interesting that you do. So go check that out.
And if you leave comments, then, when you vote up and leave comments on our subreddit, we notice the story as being, more people are interested in this story than this story, and we can pick which one to put in the show.
Yep, absolutely. Now, one last little bit of business, well, two last things really, is this show is streamed live over at jblive.tv at 1 p.m. Pacific. What time is that Eastern there, Al?
4 p.m. Eastern, 2000 UTC.
Whoa, look at you busting out the UTC. The world loves you, Alan, for it.
Yes.
Now, one of the things I'm going to start doing is giving you a state of the update, a state of the network sort of address. Not really. It's actually just going to be a casual pre-show live hangout before TechSNAP. So probably around 12:30 p.m. Pacific over at jblive.tv. Or if you're at work, you can go to jblive.am and stream in audio. And I'll be taking questions as I set up for TechSNAP in the pre-show about your, if you have a question about your favorite show, like what's going on in the Linux Action Show, or have a question for TechSNAP you want to make sure we hear, you can show up during that pre-show and get it in, and I'll probably also be taking email questions and reading them on the live stream in the future. So check that out at jblive.tv at 12:30 p.m. on Thursdays, and get your questions and hang out with us and talk to the community. All right, Alan. I should really probably stop babbling because we have a huge. This is probably going to be one of our longest TechSNAPs in a while, which is really something.
Which is crazy considering that we wrote most of this in the last couple hours, and I was worried that we weren't going to have enough.
Oh, but you sell yourself short because you follow the stories. We have several tools we use to track and monitor the stories all week. So really, it's just you work on it all week and then you brain dump couple hours before the show.
Right. Like, well, I had lots of stories tagged. It's just I hadn't read them all and done enough research, and then
Yeah. And now it's like the mind acts like a sponge and gets all the little details and connects all the little dots. And now we deliver it to you. One thing before we get to those news stories is TechSNAP is looking for sponsorship. Yeah, that's right. We're trying to make this a legitimate business. And we actually think we have a pretty great value here for you. Alan and I both have a combined nearly 20 years in the IT field. Alan is a former professor of networking technologies or something like that, right? Alan, what was it? What was networking technology?
Network engineering and security analysis.
Wow, a college professor right here on the show giving you analysis. And of course, one of the things TechSNAP has prided ourselves on is drawing from our consulting and IT backgrounds. I personally have spent years as a contract for hire hacker, penetrating people's networks, so it's a great insight for these stories. And if you'd like to get your product sponsored on this show, it's got to be something awesome because we only talk about awesome stuff, and we have incredibly intelligent listeners so they can see through the BS. But if you want your thing on here, if you got something awesome, you want to reach them, contact me, chris@jupiterbroadcasting.com, and I'd love to talk to you about a sponsorship.
For sure.
All right, Alan. Now that obnoxious business is out of the way, let's talk about our first story because it's somebody we've taken a few pot shots at on this show in the past, and now they're up right up here in the news docket. It's Facebook, and it's not looking so good for old Facebook, is it, Alan?
Well, no, it's just the
another little thing. It's one of those things, isn't it?
But actually, the exact same proof of concept works against Google Plus as well, actually.
Oh, okay.
So what it is Facebook has a URL scanner that they touted as being a big security win not that long ago.
Yeah.
Specifically, what it does is when you link to something in a post or a wall message or whatever on Facebook, it goes to that URL and checks it to make sure that it doesn't contain, links to like exploits or whatever.
Yeah, to make sure you're not trying to infect a bunch of Facebook users.
Right. And at the same time, it also grabs a thumbnail to put the little image and all, and the subject of the page and everything like that. The problem with it is that it's predictable. So basically, the page you send them to can look like it's an image, right? somesite.com/whatever/cute-kitty.jpg, right? It's a picture of somebody cat or whatever. But what's actually happening in the back end on that server is they're saying, if the user agent that's coming to get this image is, Facebook or WebSense or Google Plus, then give them the picture. But if it's a regular user, give them this code instead. In the proof of concept, it's just a redirect to a Rickroll. But it could definitely be, a zero-day flash exploit or something.
This is not quite as sophisticated as the one we talked about last week, but remember there was that story about malware that would custom tailor itself based on the client PC? Yes. This again shows remote malware.
This could do exactly the same thing, except for it's customizing itself when it sees WebSense scanner, Google Plus, or Facebook and sending legitimate content.
Wow.
And so basically, somebody
they must have a user agent. Those tools must just have some sort of user agent that says I'm a scammer.
Or you can tell from their IP reverse DNS and things like that, right?
Yeah.
And so you link to something on Facebook, people look at it and they go to click on it, expecting a funny picture of a cat, and instead they get a Rickroll or whatever.
And their day is ruined.
Yes. And if it's just a Rickroll or a Chris roll, that's one thing. But if it's a virus, that's another thing.
Yeah.
If it's a virus that changes your wallpaper to be an animated GIF of Chris Roll, then it's entirely another thing.
You kind of glossed over it, but the proof of concept is posted to the web on how to accomplish this.
Yep, and
it's just some PHP scripts?
Yeah. That's just a small one at the bottom. If you look up higher, they have some way talking about evading intrusion detection systems at Facebook and accessing the Facebook query language.
Oh, and by the way,
modified SQL.
Here's the IPs of the scanner bots.
Yep.
Here's some videos on it. Oh yeah, and here's some content script for a really good one.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness, this is really
so they have some stuff about actually accessing Facebook, so that you could make that exploit, use the user's privileges on Facebook and pull in pictures of their friends or whatever. So you could really do like spear phishing attacks and make them think it's like, oh, click here to see funny picture of person you actually know doing something ridiculous. And you click on it and you get a virus instead.
Now, of course, you're no more dangerous than you would be without this. This is just getting around those malware scanners. It just goes to show that just, don't click on anything you don't recognize.
Right. But also, five lines of PHP code and
It's kind of an obvious
and
workaround, to be honest with you.
and basically, yes, and basically 5 lines of PHP code in the Facebook URL scanner is useless.
I mean, it's kind of like no crap, no duh, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could throw this PHP file in your web root directory, and that would handle this for you. I mean, it would just in real time. I mean, that's just adorable. So don't click on links in Facebook, kids. I guess that's the moral of the story, or Google Plus. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, it should be fairly easy to tell when something's a trap.
Yeah, hopefully.
It's a trap. If it seems too good to be true, it is.
It's a trap.
If you weren't expecting to see it, it probably isn't. If it doesn't seem like the person who it's coming from would post that, then it's probably not. It's like I've seen way too many people's Facebook accounts be hijacked and post ridiculous things.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, sometimes
and then you see someone else get infected by it and like repost it, and it's like I get to like laugh at that person now because they fell for it.
That's
and
happened
I
to a
have
family
proof
member.
because now they're infected as well.
That's happened to a family member of mine.
Yes, it's like my one aunt posts something bad, and then the next thing 3 more of them are doing it, and it's like, oh my god.
Yep. Do you have any other thoughts on this story?
No, that's about it. But there's a lot more detail in the second link in the article.
Including the example code and things like that. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, why don't we talk about this Sony story? What do you say?
Yes,
this is kind of an interesting one. It's big. Yeah, 93,000 accounts have been locked down by Sony after an attempt at hacking them, right?
Right. Well, when I first read the headline and stuff, I thought that it meant 93,000 accounts had attempts against them, and they banned so many of them.
Okay. That's kind of what I took it as.
93,000 accounts that they attempted, they managed to log into, and all of them suspended.
Oh, I thought this was a completely, the way the article was kind of pitched to me, I thought it was completely preventative.
No. So basically, somebody had a giant list of usernames and passwords and attempted them against the Sony PSN and SOE. Of their list, they managed to successfully log in to 93,000 accounts.
Wow, yeah, they say here in the article that this data appears to include large number of data obtained from one of their compromises earlier.
Right, well, now Sony is saying that they haven't been hacked. They don't think they've been hacked again, and they think that the list of usernames and passwords came from some other site.
Oh, okay.
But the fact that 93,000 accounts would overlap seems a bit outrageous.
Now, now Sony saying here as a preventative measure, they're going to require more secure passwords and resets for PSN accounts.
Right, and all of those 23,000 accounts that were successfully logged into, been locked and require a reset. Only, they say 1/10% of them actually had more activity than just logging in because, well, you can't log into that many accounts.
Well, the chat room is kind of being hard on Sony, but I'm kind of looking at it like this. Bad passwords and, bad user account practices are going to happen to everybody.
Did all of these attempts come from one IP address and one IP range?
Probably.
Well, then why is that automatically not blocked after 10 failed login attempts?
That's true. But let's keep in mind they got these accounts. Who knows how bad the passwords were on? They could have been just passwords, and they locked it down. I mean, at least this isn't the process where they were hacked for several months before they got their heads out of their butt.
Right, but at the same time, why don't they not have an intrusion detection system that says, hey, this one IP is logged into 100 different accounts, or this one IP has tried to log into 100 different accounts, ban it, so that they don't manage to compromise 93,000 accounts.
I guess it's potentially an indicator that they don't have security built into the key areas, like their authentication backend should just have that built in.
Authentication system says, hey, when someone tries to log in and fails, back off timer, right?
Yeah.
You can't try again for another 10 seconds from that IP address.
And you would think right now Sony should be developing one of the most state-of-the-art network security.
These are some simple things that you could implement in a day.
Right, but the problem is, what if it's your original? I mean, what if that a lot of this stuff to tie all this stuff together is often homegrown code, or it's a bunch of vendor stuff that you can't change directly. So it's either really old stuff or it's vendor stuff, and you're just stuck in between somewhere. And I mean, they could be. I still maintain they must have some sort of fundamental infrastructure issues.
Yeah, but it's but who designs an authentication system that doesn't have some kind of rate limiting?
Yeah, boy, I agree with you on that, huh? Jeez.
So yes, this suggests that Sony has no type of automated defenses for slowing or blocking brute force attacks. So meaning that if you want to pick somebody's account and just sit there and hammer on it, they're not going to automatically block you. If you do it enough that they, in this case, they probably notice a load spike from, 200 or more thousand password attempts.
Yeah, you'd think the CPU at least would crawl up. Huh.
And so then they were like, oh, well, we'll block that or whatever. Or they just noticed, fraudulent activity on 100 accounts at once.
It says here that the attacks occurred between October 7th and 10th, so just really recently. 60,000 of the accounts were on the PlayStation and Sony networks. 33 were on the Sony Online Entertainment Network.
Yeah, so PSN and SEN are the console side and SOE is the PC side. So, and the fact that the attack was used against both kind of points to something else as well.
The other thing I think is kind of interesting is the fact here that they say that it was another company's list that got compromised. And you've heard that before, too, when Google was supposedly compromised by the Chinese for their Gmail login system. I believe they blamed an issue. Well, they didn't at first name the vendor, but it came out later. It was like an issue in Microsoft Messenger or something like that.
Right, and we've seen Google run into this with like Gawker. With that hack, how many of those people's Gmail accounts had the same password for their Gmail as their Gawker? I
guess I just kind of like to see, and I know it's not good
I remember with MT Gox, when they got hacked, they sent the list of accounts to Gmail, and Gmail locked all those accounts.
I would just like to see some of these companies for consumers. I mean, really protect consumers. If there's another company out there and Sony thinks they know what company's usernames and passwords list these people are using, name the company. I need to know as a consumer. I need to protect myself.
There's, laws saying that when you're hacked, you have to tell your customers because they have to take steps to protect themselves.
Right.
And while it's embarrassing for you, if you don't do that, you're hurting them. And it's not their fault that they happen to be a customer or a user of your service and you got hacked.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't be able to endanger their identity or whatever because you don't want to admit that you got hacked because you were lazy and didn't update your Apache since 2006.
Right. Callback. Any other thoughts on this story?
But specifically, the attack, because the number of usernames that they were successful on is so large, I don't know, like how many other services out there are going to have 200 million or 200,000 or more Sony accounts and 100,000 of them have the same username and password. I understand like a lot of people use the same username and password, but what other service is going to share 100,000 users in common with Sony? I don't think there's that many.
Other Sony services?
Right. Yeah. But it just seems unreasonable to assume that it was some other company's list. Right. Just because of how many accounts got hacked.
No, that makes sense. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Because it's not like 10,000. It's like it's like
100,000 basically.
Yeah, just about, yeah.
And it's just the fact that they didn't say specifically, but they made it sound as if but Facebook doesn't have a username. It uses an email address. And Sony uses a username.
Huh.
And I don't know, gamers tend to change their username a lot, especially like console gamers. Like as you grow up when you're a little kid, the username you pick when you're like 12 isn't the one you want to use when you're 14.
Right.
So
or depending on the game you're playing too.
Right. And so usernames change quite a bit for younger users. So I don't see how they could find such a large intersection.
So you think it's just kind of like a deferral? Oh, it's not really completely our fault.
Right. I think, they're trying to say the list must be from somewhere else. Yeah. And that's highly unlikely.
I could believe that.
So that leads to one of three hypotheses. Either the attack uses user data from the original Sony hack.
Which is what I think.
Right. So Sony forced users to reset their passwords, but did they make users not use the same password they had before?
Or have all the users done it? I mean, I haven't logged in and done it.
Right. Well, then the account should still be locked out.
Okay.
But
I don't know.
So the question is, did Sony allow users to use the same password they had before the hack? Right? Because most password systems, when you force a password to change, don't let you use the last password or the last 10 passwords or whatever.
Right.
Other thing is, do you remember that flaw in the PSN password reset system where hackers could reset other users' passwords?
Yes.
So in that case, the passwords could have reset your password.
Right.
To something. And then they have this list of usernames where they managed to reset the password.
And again, if people are using, like if they got the old compromise, if they have the old compromise list, and then they go over to, if that database list, if it did have their email address on it, if it had all of their registration information, it's a good chance they used the same password on their email account that they used for their Sony Online account, so you could just log in and reset their password that way too. I swear to God, I got to do a video on password management because this is just the number one thing right now online for online services is good password.
The other thing we saw was users being victims of the phishing scams with the PSN reset. right? So PSN sent out emails to everybody saying you have to come reset your password.
Right.
But, people sent out phishing emails that looked the same as well.
Right. Right. Yeah, and they look
And
pretty
phishing
legit.
sites and so on. And, they could have lost usernames and passwords that way as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the numbers just are so large.
Yeah, they definitely had Sony in their sights. And I think you're right. It's a good observation.
And also the fact that it was spread across PSN and SOE.
Right.
That seems like it was definitely highly targeted.
Yeah. Poor Sony.
And then so the other possibility is that they were compromised again and somebody got this giant list of usernames and passwords.
Oh my God, I hope that's not the case.
They say it's not.
Yeah, I know. I say that. I know that's what they said. We have a link in. I said I wouldn't say this a bunch, but there's a link in there to Sony's official statement, and they say they claim they weren't hacked again.
Yeah, from their chief information security officer.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this story, or should we move on?
The only other thing was that the accounts that did have fraudulent charges on their credit card, Sony is going to refund those.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Now. This next story might get your blood boiling, folks, so take a deep breath, cleanse the mind, and prepare yourself because democracy itself is at stake with this story. And boy, that's kind of not even an exaggeration, unfortunately. There's some news this week. Of course, there's been several news stories over the years, but news this week about Diebold voting machines being hacked by remote control? Alan, what?
Yes. So the National Laboratory in Illinois, I forget the name of it now, it's owned by the Department of Energy, and they do research to further national security and just anything the nation needs.
Quick sidebar, the Department of Energy also runs Area 51. Interesting enough.
Also, all the nuclear power regulation and so on.
Yeah. And apparently voting machines.
Well, they own the National Research Laboratories and they research things.
Yeah.
So according to the researchers, as many as 25% of American voters in the 2012 election will use electronic voting machines that can be compromised using $10.50 worth of off-the-shelf hardware.
What?
Or $26 worth of hardware if you want the remote control as well.
Oh, of course I want the remote control. So you mean I got to pony up
$26 per voting machine that you want to hijack.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Well, I think
most importantly, these attacks cannot be traced. Unlike the attacks we've seen before were usually cyber attacks against the back end of the voting machine, right? Changing the results after they were recorded.
Right.
And because it goes over the internet and so on, there was the chance of that being recorded. Or, and a trail leading back to you in some way. And this is a little bit of hardware you connect to do a man-in-the-middle attack between the voting machines and the back end.
So you connect a physical device to the voting machine?
Voting machine, yeah.
Okay. So you have to have physical access to the voting machine?
Yes.
Okay.
Of course, many people do.
Yeah, there's actually, I just saw a news story recently about documented cases of voting machines just being left completely unmonitored. So.
Right, but also the people that actually are in charge of running them, I don't know, I'm pretty sure in the States, but I know for sure in Canada, except for Canada doesn't use electronic voting machines, they're volunteers.
Yeah.
And so on, right? So, people that want to do this can just volunteer and they'll be left in charge of voting machines, right?
So you connect this funky looking dongle thing to the voting machine.
Yep. And now you can change the votes as they pass between the machine and the back end.
Ah, interesting.
So it seems to suggest automatically right there that the communication between the voting machine and the back end isn't over SSL.
Now, one of the things,
and
right,
the first question there is why the hell not?
This story actually came from somebody who was interviewed who's assembled one of these remote controls, right? Isn't that where he actually goes out and he talks a little bit about it?
The researchers have actually
done it?
Made a video demo, yes.
Oh, so they have a proof of concept in the sense that they actually have a video of them actually.
Of them doing it, yes.
Wow. Speaking of video, which we won't play in the show, but it was on our TechSNAP Reddit page, I guess this is actually from a little bit ago, the chat room says, but there's a programmer who under oath admitted that there's code also in some of the voting machines. Now, of course, this is just his trial. He was under oath and he testified it was true, but he says that there's code in there to actually just swing the vote one way or another depending on what they need done. So that's something worth look into because if he's under oath and he's a developer that worked on some of the software and he says that, it's probably worth following up on. And now you have this story where you have a proof of concept where a research group has hooked up a device that then gives them remote control to modify the votes as they're happening. Wow.
Well, it just seems like there's absolutely no cryptography going on at all for that to be allowed to happen.
Right.
Like, why are the voting machines not signing the packets or something on their way out so that... No, I don't know exactly how this dongle hooks up, but it definitely seems that this is the most simplistic attack yet. A lot of the other ones we've seen required massive amounts of programming and cyber warfare skills to be able to compromise an election.
Well, so, like, say here, the way the election will work for me is I'll go down to the local school where there'll be a lady who's 60 and a guy there who's 75 and then another gal there who's 40 but really excited about becoming 75. And, they just kind of point you in the direction of the machine. I mean, I've been there, I've done this. To them, they're just these dark black boxes. They don't even know how they operate at all. So if there was some dongle plugged into it, they probably just think it was the power supply or something.
Yeah. Well, in Canada, it works a little different. Like, you guys don't have ID requirements for your elections?
You have to show your license.
Right. So here, you walk in, you have to have your voter registration card, which came in the mail, and has your name and address on it.
Yeah.
And you must have photo ID, like a driver's license that matches that name and address.
Right.
And then you're allowed to go vote. But here you vote on paper, and it goes in, and then they validate it, and then you put it in the box, not them, so that you know it went in the box.
Yeah. I mean, now here in my state, we actually all mail by ballot, or we mail in now here. But that's how it was.
You can do that.
You can go down. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, any other thoughts on the story? That's a pretty big, epic one to just sit there. So I don't want to pay it short shrift because I mean, and obviously, it's coming up too. It's 2012 is just around the corner.
And it's like, especially if you want to have things like this fixed in time, they have to move like now.
Well, let's be honest. It's not going to get fixed in time.
It's not going to happen.
Because they'll say, oh, we don't want to make any major changes before the presidential election. And
then maybe they should revert to the paper ballot system that was harder to defraud.
That their claim would be that it's too overwhelming. It's too much for us to process, right? It's just can't be done. But then at the same time, they also say they get the lowest attendance that they've ever had, record low attendance all the time.
Yep.
It's, Americans aren't showing up to the polls, they're not voting. So which is it? Do you have record low attendance, or are you inundated with votes? I don't understand.
Yeah,
you guys are confusing.
How did they do it 20 years ago when more people showed up?
Yeah, so it's interesting story to follow, and I think maybe one we'll probably continue to follow here on TechSNAP as the election approaches.
Yep.
Have you any thoughts, or are you ready to move on?
No, that's about it.
All right, so you know what that means. It's time for the TechSNAP feedback. All right, it is time for the feedback segment. And of course, you can always send those in to TechSNAP at jupiterbroadcasting.com or submit them to our Reddit page at links.techsnap.tv. And the first question this week is just a quick one. It comes from Dominic, and he says, guys, subject line reads as follows. You're doing it wrong. He says, he's a huge fan, loves the show, been playing catch up. And he says, but I got a bone to pick. I wish you would format your episode file names like this: show name - season episode number, show title. He says that would allow for alphabetical ordering, and I would really appreciate it because obviously he's being OCD about the way things show up in his podcatcher or file browser or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, of course, TechSNAP doesn't have seasons, so that would be one issue there. Now, Last does. But the real problem is actually just the way our hosting provider works, Blip.tv, for some of the video files. They rename the file on their back-end storage. It's part of the CDN's deal. It just does that. So we don't have any control over that, actually. The way I upload it is it's episode title and then the episode number. And it's always in a certain format. And it does order chronologically, of course, here on our local storage. But unfortunately, probably for some sort of storage system they use, it adjusts the name. And one day when we move off of Blip TV, or if we ever do, then I'm sure that'll be fixed then. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, Alan. Let's move on to cyber. I wanted to cover that because whoa, that's a crazy shot of your face. This is also a crazy shot. Wait. Sorry for the audio, folks. We're having a little fun with the video. I wanted to cover that question just because I've gotten a lot, and I figured the TechSNAP audience is probably kind of anal about their organization a little bit. So I wanted to make sure I let people know why that craziness is there. But all right, let's move on to Cyber Ace, aka Cyber Axe, in the chat room. And he writes, guys, when building a physical network topology, say you have 5 8-port switches, are you best to connect the router to the port 1 of the switch and on switch number 1, and then connect various other computers to the rest of the ports on the switch number 1, with the last port connecting to switch number 2, which has a port to switch number 3, and so on, essentially daisy chaining these switches. And then have a master switch, and then 2, 3, and 4 basically hanging off of it.
So either he wants to know, should he daisy chain them, or should he set them up in like a tier system?
I see. So sort of like old school SCSI devices where you could chain them off of each other, right?
Right.
Or have everything just go into that first switch, is his question.
So the first switch would connect all the other switches, and the devices would be in there.
Now, well, you go ahead. I'll tell you how I do it, but I'll let you go.
Okay. Yeah, because I have a separate one about how I do it at the bottom as well.
Yeah.
So the second setup you talked about, where you have one master switch, or each port goes to one of the other switches, and then each of those switches has a bunch of PCs on it. That second setup there is the proper hierarchical networking model, which usually consists of 3 separate layers. The first layer is the access layer, and that's where your individual computers and devices are actually connected to the network. And that's relatively done with low-end switches. Usually in a business, you wouldn't use, like your little Linksys 8-port dumb switch.
Right.
But usually at that point, it's all about getting the lowest cost per port that you can, right? Because, if you have to connect 500 computers, you don't want to be spending a lot of money on each port on the switch. And those switches are sometimes what are called stackable. And that's where the daisy chaining comes in. You'd have a bunch of switches that are actually daisy chained. Usually not necessarily even over Ethernet. Sometimes it's fiber or a special connector. And that actually makes a bunch of switches act as one bigger switch. As far as the network topology is concerned,
right?
It's all one big switch. But anyway, after the access layer, you have what's called the distribution layer. And that's where most of the routers and firewalls are. Because you can control access at that. That's where you want to set up your access control. Right? You can say, people in this department can't access the computers in this department or whatever. But also because the separate access layers, if you're in the same access layer as someone else, your connection between you would likely not even go through a router. You would just go over a bunch of switches and get to the other side. So the distribution is where you actually would have to cross through a router. This is where your subnets are going to be set up as well. And then the core layer is the fastest part of the network. That's where you have the communication between the different distribution layers. So in your more limited setup at home, you're probably not going to have all 3 layers. But you can have a core layer with one switch connected to each of your other switches. And then each of those switches is a separate access layer. The advantage to this is because switches are smart, when they receive data in on one port, they only send it out the one other port that has the MAC address that the message is going to.
Yeah, they have what's called an ARP table, right? And they know
so they have a little ARP table.
Every MAC address on what port is plugged into.
They know which computers are plugged into which port. Mm-hmm. So if one of those ports goes to a different switch, it knows all of the MAC addresses on that other switch.
Well, it at least knows it's on the port that other switch plugs into.
Right. So it basically, you can have more than one MAC address on each port. So it knows, switch port number 5 goes to this list of computers.
Right.
Now, a lot of the cheaper switches will have a limit to how many MAC addresses they can store. But usually that number is like 128,000 or whatever, and you're not going to run out at home.
Right.
Because it only takes a little bit of memory to store those. So even, your typical home one maybe can do 1,000, but you're not going to have 1,000 different MAC addresses at your house. And so when it receives a packet, it knows which MAC address that packet has to go to, and it sends it only that one port. That's the difference between a switch and a hub. In a hub, it would have to send it out every port because a hub wasn't intelligent. It didn't do anything.
Right.
It just received data on one port, send it out on every port except for the one it came in on.
Which is great for packet capture because you can capture what every single port's doing, what all they're saying. But when you're on a switch, you're only going to get what's sent directly to you.
Right. That's
or
why
sent to everyone.
Some switches, like especially the fancier managed ones, you can set up a monitoring port where you can say everything that goes out this port also makes go out this other port, so I can plug my laptop in and capture the packets.
Yeah, totally.
Or some will actually have a dedicated monitoring port.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But anyway.
So in his setup, he's got what? Is he doing it for his house?
Yes.
Okay.
And he's exaggerating what he has, but he's just to get the question to come across.
Right, I gotcha. So he's like, not really going to have 8 switches in his house. I have,
even 5.
I have,
yeah,
I have 1, 2, 3, 4 switches in Yeah, I think I have 4 switches in my house.
I have 4 in my house too.
And the way I've done it is they all go back to one central switch. They have plugs. I have my main central switch has like the first 4 ports are my other switches in my house.
Mine kind of works like that, but not exactly because only the central one is gigabit, and it only has 5 ports. So all the machines that need gigabit access are on it.
Yeah.
And then some of the switches end up daisy chained because there's not enough ports.
I had the luxury of having my house wired with Cat5e when I had it built. So everything goes back to that one central switch, but that's not always an option for everybody.
Right. That's the other thing is with Ethernet, you're limited to 100 meters of distance between nodes.
Right.
Now, if the node's powered like a switch, then that means you get another 100 meters when you come out the other side of that switch.
Yeah, Ethernet actually carries a small electrical low voltage charge on it.
And so it's only good for about 100 meters. And after that, it has to go into a device that then receives the signal and resends it with a fresh bout of power.
Yeah.
And a switch does that. So you can use a switch to basically allow you to go 200 meters.
Yeah.
Which should satisfy anybody's house.
So even in his setup though, I don't think he's going to have a problem if he does daisy chain.
Right. It probably won't make that big of a difference.
No. But it'd be great if all the daisy chain ports were gigabit.
Yeah. That's the thing is some older medium range switches would have a bunch of 100 megabit ports and then one set of gigabit for connecting to other switches.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in that case, then yes, you'd want to do something like that. However, you also have to consider what your traffic's going to be like when you're deciding how to hook this up. For example, for your home setup, if we're just assume all the switches are 100 megabits because if they're gigabit, you probably don't ever have to worry about the amount of traffic and so on.
Okay.
But if you do the core setup where you have one core router or one core switch and the 4 access switches, then the link between the core layer and the access layer can be a bottleneck. Right? Because if you have a bunch of people on switch number 3 trying to talk to one or more people on switch number 2, then in total, that's limited to 100 megabits.
Bring that diagram back up here. So you're saying, of course, right? Because they're all going to get bunched up.
Yeah, if you have people, two groups of people on different access switches, all trying to talk to each other, then they're bottlenecked by the single link between
that one uplink,
to the core.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you had 2 pairs of clients communicating with each other, so there's 4 machines. A is talking to B, and C is talking to D. If they're all on the same switch, they could each talk at 100 megabits a second.
Sure.
Right? Because each port can do 100 megabits, and the switch knows when it's coming from A and going to B, C and D don't need to see the traffic at all. And so it doesn't interfere with the traffic between C and D. So they can all communicate at 100 megabits a second. However, if we assume A and C are on access layer switch number 2, and B and D are access switch number 3, so A and B are on 2, and A and C are on 2, and B and D are on 3, then the traffic between them would be limited to 50 megabits each if they're talking at the same time. Right? So if A is sending to B and C is sending to D, then the total that switch number 2 can send to switch number 3 is 100 megabits.
So the key thing would be to try not to have machines that are talking to each other a lot on a bunch of
to cross
switches
those separate switches
that are far apart.
Right. And now with the idea that these distribution level, you'd have access switches for everybody in a department. And then if the traffic has to leave that department, then it goes up to the distribution switch. Right? And it goes across and hits some other department. And that makes sense. So if you're going to set this up, you kind of have to think of each switch as a different department.
I'm kind of with Project Morris on this one. It's starting to sound like 802.11n or something like that is almost an easier solution. Just plug back into that main switch. If you can reach the distance and the speed will work for you, it'd save yourself a lot of trouble here.
Okay. Right, but I think this is more just theoretical.
Yeah,
so
no, absolutely.
People understand how it works.
That is a funny observation.
If you set this up a little differently, then you could get the speed you want. And then the other thing he asked about was he was worried about creating loops in his router. And you can actually do that with this setup. If you set up even to that core layer where you have the core and the 4 switches, if you then randomly connect 2 of those switches with a cable, you can create a loop.
Yeah.
And so to prevent that, A, the computer or the switch usually only lets one MAC address be on one port at a time, but it will change, and so you can still get a loop. So
the switch can try to accommodate with that, but it starts. Some switches start to just freak the F out by just trying to manage that.
Right, and so what you want to do is make sure that each switch only has one path to each other switch.
Right.
And the core one makes that easy, right? They all go to the core and they don't go to each other at all. With the daisy chaining, it gets a little more complicated, but it's not usually that big a deal. Now, higher end switches, specifically ones that have management ports, like where you actually have a command line or a web interface to control them, those will use something called the spanning tree protocol, and they will learn about the topology and using broadcast messages and anycast messages, broadcast and multicast messages, and learn about the links and notice when they have duplicate links or two paths between switches. And so they'll, turn one of those off and not use it.
Mm-hmm.
But then if one of those links goes away, then it learns and says, oh, well, I'll use this second link that I was ignoring before because now it's the only path.
Mm-hmm. As long as that doesn't trigger at the wrong time, that's actually kind of a nice feature.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've had it trigger at the wrong time. I'll tell you that. When it was back in the early days, back when it was early, I've had it, and then it's just the craziest network problems that start when you have a loop like that.
And it's like, you can't tell what the hell was going on.
No, it's really bizarre.
So a little bit of the example of my house. So I have a 5-port gigabit switch.
Okay.
And then throughout my house, there are 3 other 100 megabit switches. So my PC and then the router and file server and my media center are all connected to the gigabit because they need the gigabit because they're dealing with video and stuff.
Yeah.
The 4th port then goes to one of the other 100 megabit switches, which is a wireless access point.
Oh, okay.
And the 5th goes to a switch in my bedroom, which is for like my laptop and the spare computer in there and whatever.
Yeah.
Basically, there's only one cable that runs from the living room to my bedroom.
That's the advantage of the daisy chain system.
Right. There's only one cable that goes from my living room to my bedroom, but there's more than one computer in my bedroom. So a switch lets me connect them all.
And does that one that goes to your bedroom, does that go back to get a port on the gigabit? Or do you have
It does.
Yeah.
But the switch on the other end of it's only 100 megabits, so it doesn't matter.
Wow, okay.
And then the 3rd 100 megabit switch is in this rack over here.
The one behind you for the audio listeners. It's in this.
And that one actually doesn't get a port in the gigabit because there aren't any ports left. So it actually uses a spare port on that wireless access point.
With all the data center equipment that you work with, I'm surprised you haven't just gotten your hands on a... Well, if you had a spare switch, you'd probably put it in the data center.
Yeah, all the spare ones are in the data center.
Yeah. The switch I have, I landed myself like a $5,000 switch because the client went out of business, and they're like, well, here's the computer equipment.
Picture of that closet. That looks awesome.
Yeah, they're like, here, do you want, we'll sell this to you for $200. I'm like, okay. And then later on, they're like, well, we can't even pay you the $200, so we'll just call it a trade for a little more work to help us get our emails forwarded and things like that. I'm like, okay, great deal. Now, I've got to ask you, so this isn't exactly the ultimate, so we kind of took a quick deviation from the ultimate home server stuff, but I think, before we wrapped all that ultimate server stuff up, we wanted to talk a little bit about ZFS, and I know we've gotten a lot of requests to talk about ZFS.
And I wanted to do it. Just
what do you think? Do you think
so
maybe
much
next
to cover?
week?
I'm hoping, yes.
We could always break it down into a couple of parts if that would make it easier to take on.
Possibly.
If it's too much for one episode, maybe we break it up.
Yeah.
But yeah. All right. Well, if you want to get your feedback heard on TechSNAP, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can email us, techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com, or go to links.techsnap.tv and submit it on the Reddit, which is the preferred way, I'll be honest. Also, people have been getting a hold of us on Google+. That's also worked great for both Alan and I. And, of course, our Twitter handles are all over the show notes and on the lower thirds. All right, Alan, let's wrap up with the feedback and move on to the roundup. All right, and welcome to the Roundup. The Roundup here on TechSNAP is stories that didn't quite make it into the main show, but usually ones that we thought were so interesting we still wanted to cover, or maybe we didn't have enough information on, but we want to put on your radar, and of course we always encourage further reading. Now, Alan, the top story on the Roundup. Now, we don't really have a top story per se, but the one that was a good follow-up story, so I thought we should put it towards the top, is a little follow-up to the DigiNotar SSL search story that we covered a while ago. And finally, after what has been way too long, Apple has released iOS 5, which revokes those DigiNotar SSL certificates.
Now, DigiNotar's been completely out of business for like a month now, hasn't it?
Yeah, and what about, I don't know if iOS 4 users will be receiving a fix to get this either. I didn't catch that in the story, but at least it's fixed for iOS 5 users if you can get it. All right, Alan, the next, and you guys can go read that if you want. The next story is one that kind of
Yes.
is an interesting one probably for a lot of Windows users out there. It benchmarks the different antivirus systems' impact on your PC performance.
So it compares a couple of things, but yes, how the virus scanner impacts the performance of your PC, but also what percentage of known viruses it actually catches.
Oh, interesting.
And a couple other benchmarks.
So this is if you're out there shopping for AV or you're trying to figure out if you should go with AV or if the one you got's a good one, this is a good article to go check out. I like that.
Yeah, and they have a bunch of, graphs which are easy to get the summary without having to read everything.
Graphs are always good. All right, the next story on the roundup is kind of an interesting one if it actually comes out to be true. I'm kind of skeptical, but Amazon in talks with HP to buy the Palm division. Would this be interesting as sort of a buy to maybe secure WebOS for future Kindles? Because if you remember, right, the Kindle, while they run on Android now, the new ones that just came out, they run that really sort of, I don't know, I don't want to call it, well, I guess it's kind of proprietary, the Amazon system on top of Android. So I don't think it would be that much for them to port that to some other system. It doesn't have to sit on Android. It's just what they chose to use now. They don't put Android anywhere on the product. They didn't mention Android, so don't seem particularly married to Android. So maybe they would want WebOS. What do you think?
I'm not sure. We'll have to see.
Yeah, we'll have to see what happens. Like I say, seems like if they did it, it would have to be at least a while before they incorporated anything of significance. Now, did we cover, I know I mentioned it on the faux show, but did we cover the whole Scarlett Johansson nude? I don't think we talked about it on the show, right? Her nudie pics getting leaked online. Well, they supposedly, I guess, they tracked down the guy who hacked into Mila Kunis or whatever her name is and Scarlett Johansson's email accounts and then leaked their nudie photos online. Now, remember, if you recall, originally it was they hacked her BlackBerry, and now the story's been modified that he hacked their email accounts, and
which is probably what was on the BlackBerry's email, right?
Yeah, good point. Because they did seem like cell phone pictures, and not that I looked. No, and they probably were. Yeah, it's probably maybe she must have emailed them somebody. But anyways, so they supposedly caught the dude that did it. And he's he one hurting mofo now. And I got to tell you, they're blasting him with some massive accounts of identity theft over this. He's getting set up with identity theft. In fact, he's on track right now with all of the counts of identity theft for 125 years in prison. It's pretty significant.
Was some of this related to other things that he did, not just?
Well, he got a couple of
accounts.
He got a couple of accounts, including Christina Aguilera, Mila Kunis, Scarlett Johansson, and a few others. I guess supposedly the grand total number is 50 people. So he got 50 people's email accounts, including these celebrities, and now they're prosecuting.
Call it identity theft if you send an email as them, or
they're
something?
using that. The reason they're doing that is they're able to use an existing law that allows them to sort of claim that as identity theft because you're imposing as them to get access to those accounts.
Not really. Guessing someone's password is not identity theft.
I agree. I was wondering what you would think about that because that's one of the things they're going after him for.
U.S. laws are all so retarded.
You got to feel for these people because he took one for all of mankind and now he's going to jail for it.
Yeah.
No, he shouldn't have hacked their accounts, but I think the response is excessive.
That's unlawful access to a secure computer system or whatever it's called, not identity theft. Unless I'd have to see more details about exactly what they're accusing him of, but it seems like 125 years is ridiculous. It really seems like they don't want to go to trial about this. They want him to just accept a deal to not have to deal with 125 years.
Well, and they're always trying to make an example out of hackers. Like that too, even from Kevin Mitnick, when Kevin Mitnick was arrested. Oh, we have to make an example. Well,
he has to be in solitary confinement because he could whistle into a cell phone and start a thermonuclear war.
When do you stop making examples and just treat people like citizens who made a mistake? I mean, I'm not trying to defend what he did, but
it was.
I kind of am.
He just broke a law. You can't make an example.
Not breaking a law, although I kind of wish
making an example of someone is a violation of the justice system, right?
Oh, good point.
That's not justice. Because I was the first person to make news about breaking this law, I should have a more severe punishment than the next person.
That's not justice. That's showmanism or something. I don't know what that is.
It's ridiculous. You can't. Right. Making an example of someone is not justice.
Let's talk about the next story in the roundup. It is the roundup hour. We're supposed to keep moving here.
Yep.
And that not breaking any laws was Google, although I wish they had. This is just sort of, a PSA, for Gmail and Google users is that remember, anything you put in there, they'll hand over without a warrant.
Well, no, this one was with a court order.
Yeah, it was
they resisted first.
It wasn't it wasn't not a warrant. It was a court order, but that's not the same as a warrant for some reason. But
Right.
they handed over the IP address data and login information of a WikiLeaks volunteer and a developer of the Tor project, which is come on, the Tor
Especially
project.
the Tor project, they had no right.
And Google doesn't notify the account holder that this happens.
Well, they wanted to, and they petitioned the government to be able to.
Right, but they don't.
The government had a gag order saying that Google was like preventing Google from being able to tell the account holder.
And it's in Google's terms of service that they will respond to legal requests like this.
Right.
I mean, it says...
no, there was another ISP involved in this one, Sonic.net.
SonicNet.
And
SonicNet.
they spent quite a bit of their own money trying, on lawyers trying to prevent this from happening or being allowed to notify the user before they handed over the data.
It happens quite a bit. According to a transparency report, Google received 4,601 user data requests from the U.S. government in just the second half of 2010 alone. And Google complied with 94% of those requests. So, I mean,
there is an advantage to running your own email server.
Yeah, and a lot of the comments on Reddit were like, oh, well, now they're going to know about my Amazon purchase confirmations and my Ticketmaster stuff. And that might be true. And so, you should make that evaluation when you're picking to use your Google services.
If it's super sensitive, it should be encrypted, and it shouldn't be with Google or anyone else.
We had a question submitted to the TechSNAP Reddit that I thought would be a good way to kick off the next story in the roundup, and it came from Barba Wobble or something like that. He says, about the BlackBerry outages that happened this week. He says, I'm confused as to why a broken switch at the BlackBerry RIM company stops people from emailing or web browsing. He says, I guess BlackBerry email addresses didn't work, BlackBerry Messenger wouldn't work. That makes sense, but why all the other services? And that's going off of, if you didn't catch it this week, if you're not maybe a BlackBerry user or a corporate user, RIM suffered a massive worldwide outage, which first started like over in Europe and some of the other countries sort of outside the U.S. And then starting yesterday, spread to the U.S. RIM has posted an apology letter about this, but...
so apparently something happened with their instant messenger service in Europe.
And they say they have a dual redundant high-capacity switch that went out that sort of started a backlog with that.
Right, and then what it was saying was that eventually the backlog from US and Canada to Europe was so big that it took out the Canadian server as well.
Mm-hmm. And he's asking, well, why? Okay, I can understand that affects the messenger service. Why did it affect things like email and web? I didn't actually know if it affected web, but I know
that
email
goes through the BlackBerry service.
Yeah,
right? That was what made a BlackBerry different than every other phone, was this idea of push email.
Mm-hmm.
Where the phone didn't have to wake up, use this battery, and call in and check your email every so many minutes. It got a notification telling it there was a new email it should go get. And so that relies on the BlackBerry service, which was basically the IM service and email service aren't separated such that one can be down without the other being down.
Yeah, they said they had cascade failures. I mean, they're extremely apologetic about it. But you got to think the timing is really bad. I mean, RIM has just kind of not had a lot of great success recently to begin with. Yep. And it's on the week the iPhone S comes out. And so you got to figure there's going to be some BlackBerry users like, well, screw this thing. I'm going to go get, or whatever they're going to go buy. So, boy, bad timing for poor RIM.
Yeah, but again, a lot of BlackBerry users didn't buy their BlackBerry. It was, it's part of their job that they get a BlackBerry or whatever.
The clients, I talked to clients yesterday who had their BlackBerry service that was not working for them. And they, contacted me at first because they thought it was a problem with the email server.
Right.
Which I didn't know at first either. I saw that, it took me like about 5 minutes before I remembered I'd read that RIM headline that they were having issues. Let's talk about this last story on the roundup here. And this one's one that happened back on September 30th, but we kept it on our radar because it was kind of funny and continued to have issues. And that was Microsoft security products started flagging Google Chrome as a virus. And it's kind of funny because if you're like a Security Essentials user out there, pretty popular. It's also in that benchmark we mentioned earlier. It started identifying it as a Trojan, right?
I'm not sure which type
And then
of virus,
Microsoft pushed out an update to fix that, but it then continued to have issues, and they had to push out a second update later on that day. And of course, Google was just sort of lambasted by this and was trying to apologize, but they didn't really have any information what was going on and things like that. It's kind of a funny story to read, so I thought we'd toss that in the roundup because it's one that's kind of been on our radar for a couple of weeks.
Yep.
Yeah. Boy, Alan.
Well, because at the same time, from Google's perspective, they don't know, is it a false positive or is it some product pretending to be Chrome or a version of Chrome with a virus, and that's what these people have.
Yeah. Totally.
Is it authentic Chrome? And if it is, then it's a false positive. If it's not, then it actually is a virus, and we can't tell people it's just a false positive.
It's just must be just a funny coincidence that they're competitors, and they make a competing browser. It's kind of funny. Alan, I think we're getting towards the end of this episode. Is there anything else you want to cover?
Nope, I think that's it.
Well, you should tell. You're never tell people about like Scale Engine or something. So people can go check out what you do. They must be curious. Where do they go to find out about what Scale Engine is and what it does?
Yeah, scaleengine.com is our website, and under the if you go under the networking page at the bottom, there's a bunch of diagrams that actually explain some of how the stuff works if you ever wanted to know.
Fancy.
But mostly what we do is scalable PHP hosting. So if your website is too big for shared hosting, or even too big for a dedicated server like Jupiter Broadcasting got, then our system allows that to continue to scale up beyond that.
Yeah, it works great too, because like we can have a week where we have some really big episodes, and it just goes right up it scales right up to that demand, and
because it's all usage based, you don't have to buy more than you need, right? You pay for exactly as much as you used, and that's it. So you don't have to worry about buying, a lot of packages, people ask like, how many gigabytes bandwidth does it come with? Well, it doesn't come with any. You just pay so much per gigabyte as you use it.
And it's cheap too, so it's great.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, it can be as low as 4 cents a gigabyte.
Yeah. And it's worked great for us, and it's.
And we are also introducing video streaming products.
Oh, I know you and I are going to talk a lot about that, because that sounds right up my alley.
Yep.
So.
And we do CDN as well. If you already have web hosting and you don't want to change that, we can take care of things like offloading all of the images on your website through our caching servers, which we have located.
Which helps with your Google SEO ranking. Google checks for that kind of stuff when they spider your site.
It just makes the site faster.
Google actually takes into consideration when they're looking at your overall search ranking, if you have images that load from an alternative domain than your main domain, because then that means your page loads faster, and they actually calculate that into your overall search ranking. So something to consider is the overall performance that something like that can bring to your site.
Like we added that to Jupiter Broadcasting for all the little images, because if you have a WordPress-based site, it's just a little plugin you add, and you're good to go.
And the awesome way it works is then people get those files like images and things like that from a server that's probably closer to them than it normally would have been.
Right. We use a geographic DNS system, and we have, almost 40 servers in 13 different data centers in 5 different countries.
Around the world.
Yes.
Awesome.
And so, getting the images from a server that's closer to you makes it a lot faster.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
And yes, loading images off multiple subdomains means the browser does each separate subdomain concurrently. Meaning
it's
you get
like
more
RAID for your images. You load it from multiple streams at once. Yep.
Exactly.
And it really helps. And you can really notice. And on browsers that are really fast, like all of the modern browsers, it just makes your page pop. Like if you ever notice, like your page still kind of renders, even though everybody says Chrome is faster than a speeding bullet. Well, it really is really fast, but you have to be able to get that content to it. Of course, you have to have a fast client machine too.
Exactly. And our CDN does over 1 billion image loads per month.
Wow. 1 billion served per month, huh?
Yes. So
that's as good as a big Mac.
If you do the math on that really quick, that's more than 360 requests per second. And that's the average. So it's higher than that during the peak time of the day, and a little bit lower during the low time of the day.
Man, if you were McDonald's, you'd be making a lot of people fat with that kind of stuff. Yeah. All right, Alan. Well, that's good stuff. I'm glad we mentioned that. Okay, everyone. Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of TechSNAP. Be sure to go over to jupiterbroadcasting.com and download this episode and leave us a comment right there on the show notes. That's always another great place to leave us feedback, is right there in the show notes, because then a bunch of other people can read it and see what you said as well. But TechSNAP does come out every single week, so be sure to tune in right back here next Friday.